all out. And that was a place as was tempting for a husband to stay in, was it? He soon finds out gin shops, where all is clean and bright, and where the fires blaze cheerily and gives a man a welcome, as it were. Alice, who was standing near for the convenience of hearing, had caught much of this speech, and it was evident the subject had previously been discussed by the women, for she chimed in. "I wish our Jem could speak a word to the Queen about factory work for married women. But he comes it strong when once you get him to speak about it. Wife o' his'n will never work away from home. I say it's Prince Albert as ought to be asked how he'd like his missus to be from home when he comes in, tired and worn, wanting someone to cheer him, and maybe her to come in by and by, just as tired and down in the mouth, and how he'd like for her never to be at home to see to the cleaning of his house or to keep a bright fire in his grate, let alone his meals being all hugger-mugger and comfortless. I'd be bound, prince as he is, if his missus served him so, he'd be off to a gin palace or summat o' that kind. So why can't he make a law against poor folks' wives working in factories?" Mary ventured to say that she thought the Queen and Prince Albert could not make laws, but the answer was, "Pooh! Don't tell me it's not the Queen as makes laws, and isn't she bound to obey Prince Albert? And if he said they mustn't, why she'd say they mustn't, and then all folk would say, 'Oh no, we never shall do any such thing no more.'" "Jem's getting on rarely," said Alice, who had not heard her sister's last burst of eloquence, and whose thoughts were still running on her nephew and his various talents. "He's found out somewhat about crank or tank, I forget rightly which it is, but the master's made him foreman, and he all the while turning off hands. But he said he could not part with Jim nohow. He's good wage now. I tell him he'll be thinking of marrying soon, and he deserves a right down good wife, that he does." Mary went very red and looked annoyed, although there was a secret spring of joy deep down in her heart at hearing Jem so spoken of. But his mother only saw the annoyed look, and was piqued accordingly. She was not over and above desirous that her son should marry. His presence in the house seemed a relic of happier times, and she had some little jealousy of his future wife, whoever she might be. Still, she could not bear anyone not to feel gratified and flattered by Jem's preference, and full well she knew how above all others he preferred Mary. Now she had never thought Mary good enough for Jem, and her late neglect in coming to see her still rankled a little in her breast. So she determined to invent a little, in order to do away with any idea Mary might have that Jem would choose her for his right down good wife, as Aunt Alice called it. "Aye, he'll be for taking a wife soon." And then, in a lower voice, as if confidentially, but really to prevent any contradiction or explanation from her simple sister-in-law, she added, "It'll not be long afore Molly Gibson, that's her at the provision shop around the corner, will hear a secret as will not displease her, I'm thinking. She's been casting sheep's eyes at our Jem this many a day, but he thought her father would not give her to a common working man. But now he's good as her every bit. I thought once he'd a fancy for thee, Mary, but I do not think you'd ever suited. So it's best as it is." By an effort Mary managed to keep down her vexation, and to say she hoped he'd be happy with Molly Gibson. She was very handsome, for certain. "Aye, and a notable body, too. I'll just step upstairs and show you the patchwork quilt she gave me but last Saturday." Mary was glad she was going out of the room. Her words irritated her, perhaps not the less because she did not fully believe them. Besides, she wanted to speak to Alice, and Mrs. Wilson seemed to think that she, as the widow, ought to absorb all the attention. "Dear Alice," began Mary, "I'm so grieved to find you so deaf. It must have come on very rapid." "Yes, dear, it's a trial, I'll not deny it. Pray God give me strength to find out its teaching. I felt it sore one fine day when I thought I'd go gather some meadowsweet to make tea for Jane's cough, and the fields seemed so dree and still, and at first I could not make out what was wanting, and then it struck me it were the song of the birds, and that I never should hear their sweet music no more, and I could not help crying a bit. But I have much to be thankful for. I think I'm a comfort to Jane, if I'm only someone to scold now and then, poor body. It takes off her thoughts from her sore losses when she can scold a bit. If my eyes are left, I can do well enough. I can guess at what folks are saying." The splendid red and yellow patch quilt now made its appearance, and Jane Wilson would not be satisfied unless Mary praised it all over, border, center, and groundwork, right side and wrong, and Mary did her duty, saying all the more, because she could not work herself up at the very hearty admiration of her rival's present. She made haste, however, with her commendations, in order to avoid encountering Jem. As soon as she was fairly away from the house and street, she slackened her pace and began to think. Did Jem really care for Molly Gibson? Well, if he did, let him. People seemed all to think he was much too good for her, Mary's own self. Perhaps someone else, far more handsome and far more grand, would show him one day that she was good enough to be Mrs. Henry Carson. So temper, or what Mary called spirit, led her to encourage Mr. Carson more than ever she had done before. Some weeks after this there was a meeting of the trades union to which John Barton belonged. The morning of the day on which it was to take place he had lain late in bed, for what was the use of getting up? He had hesitated between the purchase of meal or opium, and had chosen the latter, for its use had become a necessity with him. He wanted it to relieve him from the terrible depression its absence occasioned. A large lump seemed only to bring him into a natural state, or what had been his natural state formerly. 8 o'clock was the hour fixed for the meeting, and at it were read letters filled with details of woe from all parts of the country. Fierce, heavy gloom brooded over the assembly, and fiercely and heavily did the men separate towards 11 o'clock, some irritated by the opposition of others to their desperate plans. It was not a night to cheer them, as they quitted the glare of the gas-lighted room and came out into the street. Unceasing, soaking rain was falling. The very lamps seemed obscured by the damp upon the glass, and their light reached but to a little distance from the posts. The streets were cleared of passers-by. Not a creature seemed stirring, except here and there a drenched policeman in his oilskin cape. Barton wished the others good night, and set off home. He had gone through a street or two, when he heard a step behind him, but he did not care to stop and see who it was. A little further the person quickened step, and touched his arm very lightly. He turned and saw, even by the darkness visible of that badly lighted street, that the woman who stood by him was of no doubtful profession. It was told by her faded finery, all unfit to meet the pelting of that pitiless storm, the gauze bonnet once pink, now dirty white, the muslin gown, all draggled and soaking wet up to the very knees, the gay-colored barège shawl, closely wrapped round the form, which yet shivered and shook as the woman whispered, "I want to speak with you." He swore an oath and bade her begone. "I really do. Don't send me away. I'm so out of breath I cannot say all I would at once." She put her hand to her side and caught her breath with evident pain. "I tell thee I'm not the man for thee," adding an opprobrious name. "Stay," said he, as a thought suggested by her voice flashed across him. He gripped her arm, the arm he had just before shaken off, and dragged her, faintly resisting, to the nearest lamp-post. He pushed the bonnet back and roughly held the face she would fain have averted to the light, and in her large, unnaturally bright grey eyes, her lovely mouth half open, as if imploring the forbearance she could not ask for in words, he saw at once the long-lost Esther, she who had caused his wife's death. Much was like the gay creature of former years, but the glaring paint, the sharp features, the changed expression of the whole. But most of all he loathed the dress, and yet the poor thing, out of her little choice of attire, had put on the plainest she had to come on that night's errand. "So it's thee, is it? It's thee!" exclaimed John, as he ground his teeth and shook her with passion. "I've looked for thee long at corners of streets and such like places. I knew I should find thee at last. Thee'll maybe bethink thee of some words I spoke, which put thee up at the time somewhat about street-walkers. But oh no, thou art none of them knots. No one thinks thou art who sees thy fine draggle-tailed dress and thy pretty pink cheeks, stopping for very want of breath. Oh, mercy, John, mercy! Listen to me, for Mary's sake." She meant his daughter, but the name only fell on his ear as belonging to his wife, and it was adding fuel to the fire. In vain did her face grow deadly pale around the vivid circle of paint. In vain did she gasp for mercy. He burst forth again. "And thou names that name to me, and thou thinkst the thought of her will bring thee mercy? Dost thou know it was thee who killed her, as sure as ever Cain killed Abel? She'd loved thee as her own, and she'd trusted thee as her own, and when thou wert gone, she never held head up again, but died in less than a 3 week. And at her judgment day she'll rise and point to thee as her murderer, or if she don't, I will." He flung her, trembling, sinking, fainting from him, and strode away. She fell with a feeble scream against the lamp-post, and lay there in her weakness, unable to rise. A policeman came up in time to see the close of these occurrences, and concluding from Esther's